Nirvana were looking to make a change. Months of dissatisfaction led them here, in the office of some record label bigwig, waiting in awkward silence. Now, I assure you, they would have preferred pulling teeth, but all the dentists were busy that day, and they needed to get off of Sub Pop, even if it meant dealing with executives like this guy. Actually, this guy. He's the one that finally broke the silence, belting at the band from across the room. "What do you guys want?" Frontman Kurt Cobain, never one to bend to an authority figure, slammed his hands on the man's desk, looked him in the eyes, and declared, "We want to be the biggest f***ing band in the world." Drummer Dave Grohl recalls thinking Kurt was joking. Unless you were frozen in a solid block of ice in August of 1991 and forced to watch this as soon as you de-thawed, you've heard of Nirvana. If you were frozen, hi, I'm Mark, here's a blanket. Odds are you've heard of the band through one of these songs: In Bloom, Something in the Way, Lithium, Come As You Are, and of course, Smells Like Teen Spirit. What do these songs have in common? A baby I sadly can't show you named Nevermind. Terrible name for a baby, otherwise great album. Nevermind released in September of 1991, and despite low expectations, it reached gold record status in late October, and platinum just a month later. In the process, skyrocketing Nirvana into mega stardom. They were on the cover of Rolling Stone, MTV, SNL, and basically every radio station in the country. Bassist Krist Novoselic, drummer Dave Grohl, and especially frontman Kurt Cobain inched closer to household names than any alternative band had ever come, culminating in a truly unequaled achievement. Nevermind hit #1 on the Billboard Top 200. Now, I'm sure this sounds plenty impressive to most of you, but I worry that you just don't grasp how impressive this really is. The Billboard Top 200 tracks the most popular albums in the United States, putting country music, hip-hop, pop, and everything else head-to-head. In recent years, it's pretty rare for an alternative album to make a dent on the list, and in the 90s especially, it was considered a fringe genre. Nirvana was competing with Garth Brooks, MC Hammer, Ice Cube, Guns N' Roses, Metallica, U2, and Michael f***ing Jackson. Yet in spite of this, they managed to hang on to the top 10 for 33 weeks, hitting #1 twice, and staying on the list proper for 664 weeks, or 12 and a half years! God! I want to explore why Nevermind was so enormously and uniquely popular. But in order to understand the story of the album, you need a little context. Nevermind and Nirvana as a band would be fundamentally different if not for the events of November 1990. It was the month Nirvana signed to a major record label. Originally, they were working under Sub Pop, but the indie label was consistently coming up short. Nirvana went without promotion, interviews, tour support, even a second album. The choice to pursue a major label was a no-brainer, and sort of necessary thanks to their messy contract. But the decision of which label came after months of deliberation. There was a short period when the band considered signing to a major, taking the money, and disbanding for shits and giggles. But reason prevailed just this once, and the band signed to DGC legitimately, a subsidiary of Geffen. At a time when many major labels were clawing over themselves to sign the next lucrative alternative band, DGC was one of the few not fighting for Nirvana's hand in marriage. Instead, they had an ace up their sleeve: Sonic Youth. Under the label, the alternative rock pioneers released the moderate hit Goo just months prior, and while DGC didn't fight the hardest or pay the most or stand the tallest, above all, Kurt was looking for a company that would support Nirvana, that would enable them to function at their best. And DGC was that company. So, with the Herculean task of signing a major label completed and another album on the horizon, you might assume Kurt Cobain had finally caught a break. If so, why? Never assume that. The frontman had a lifelong bad luck streak, in spite of his incredible success. Case in point, the same month he signed the Geffen deal, his girlfriend Toby Vale dumped him. The timing was purely coincidental, but in hindsight, utterly predictable. Kurt had been seeing the Bikini Kill drummer for a few months, and they'd grown close, but Toby made it clear from the start that she wasn't interested in anything serious. While Kurt was. He was monogamous, he was romantic, and with Toby gone, he was just a wreck, just a mess. This would be the greatest heartbreak of Kurt's adult life, and the change in his mental state would manifest in his music. The frontman had written based on emotion before, but never quite like this, with biographer Charles Cross explaining, in the 4 months following their breakup, Kurt would write a half dozen of his most memorable songs, all of them about Toby Vale. Nevermind was a Nirvana project totally unlike its predecessors, which brings us to the first reason for the album's success: the album. Alright, I'm gonna start the meat of the video with a hot take. Please don't get mad at me, okay? Alright, Nevermind is a great album. Hey, wait, come back! I feel like it goes without saying that a major factor in the overwhelming success of Nevermind was the quality of the album. And, as many of you know, a big part of that quality comes from the band. The lyrics, the vocals, the staggering guitar and crashing drums, but there's more to it than that. As Ira Roberts wrote for Rolling Stone at the time, the thrashing Nevermind boasts an adrenalized pop heart, and incomparably superior material to Bleach, captured with roaring clarity by co-producer Butch Vig. While many of you are already neck-deep in the comments fuming at the criticism of Bleach, I can't imagine anyone disagrees with the latter quote. Which is a little strange. Music producers are often either completely useless, "Did the trained vocals come in yet?" Chill. Or the unsung hero of an album's quality. So Butch Vig getting as much credit as he gets should tell you something. His involvement began in April of 1990, when Nirvana defied Sub Pop, taking drastic measures to finish a new album. They booked 1 week of studio time in Madison, Wisconsin, and attempted to record the entire project as fast as possible. An album called Sheep. To the band's credit, they got pretty close. Honestly, a week is often plenty of time for the average indie band, but Kurt just could not stand the drumming of Chad Channing, and everything sort of fell apart from there. Bummer. Still, it was a productive experiment, yielding 5 tracks in common with the eventual Nevermind, and proving to Kurt once and for all who would be the band's next producer. The owner of that small Wisconsin studio, Butch Vig. A fella described by Nirvana biographer Mike Azerrad as an immensely nice man and a supremely nice guy. Aww. It was Butch alone who Kurt thought could fix the band's previous mistakes. The frontman had always considered himself a pop head, often annoying Olympia punks with constant praise of the Beatles and the Knack. On Bleach, however, he was forced to hold back that side of his influence in favor of pleasing the sub-pop audience. We purposely made that record one-dimensional, more rock than it should have been. Enter Butch Vig. Although more recently boasting credits on Tad's 8-Way Santa and the Smashing Pumpkins' Gish, he cut his teeth on smaller, toned-down pop-adjacent records like Figure 5's Born to Vacation and Spooner's The Fugitive Dance. It was this equal understanding of light and heavy mixed with a background in drumming that made Vig Kurt's ideal choice. The drumming bit especially. Cobain had always butted heads with Nirvana's drummers, often stemming from his high expectations. And while Dave had already proven himself both as an adequate percussionist and friend, it would ultimately be in the hands of the producer and mixer to finally get it right. So in April of 1991, Butch and the band reunited in Los Angeles, California. Their home for the next 6 weeks would be Sound City Studios, a major upgrade. It was there that Tom Petty recorded Damn the Torpedoes, Neil Young recorded After the Gold Rush, Fleetwood Mac recorded Rumors, and Evel Knievel recorded his 1974 spoken word self-titled debut album, Evel Knievel. Guess which one excited Kurt the most? As the band had already planned and rehearsed so extensively before their time in the studio, and Butch knew when to give Kurt his space, the only conflict arose during post-production. It was clear from the beginning that while DGC were willing to give the band plenty of creative control, they never totally approved of Vig as producer. He was too unknown for their liking, too indie, and so when A&R man Gary Gersh noticed Butch was looking a little weary at the start of the mixing process, he took the opportunity to replace him with an industry veteran, Andy Wallace. Nirvana did not like industry veteran Andy Wallace. We'd get in and he'd play us his mix, and he wasn't too kind to suggestions. It's from Wallace's influence that we get our next factor in the album's success: cleanliness. Sure, Nevermind sounded considerably more punk than anything else on the radio, but there's a reason it's not remembered very fondly by hardcore grunge fans. Compare it to basically any sub-pop album, and it sounds like the Monkees. Even just to Michael Azerrad, Chris complained about electronic sleight of hand, Dave about digital-sounding drums, and Kurt, well, looking back at the production of Nevermind, I'm embarrassed by it now. It's closer to a Motley Crue record than it is a punk record. But hey, Motley Crue was pretty big, and even more recently, the hate for Nevermind among grunge and punk circles has subsided considerably. Just browsing Reddit, it seems overhated has usurped overrated as the consensus. So, all's well that ends well. Butch Vig himself actually gave another reason why he believed Nevermind was so successful. Explaining about Kurt Cobain, if you took all his songs and had someone else sing them, it wouldn't be the same. Adding, there's a mystery and passion and intensity and something that's almost otherworldly in his voice. Vig signed on to produce Nirvana's second album, expecting more of the same. Although it would be his first major label project and first time spending more than a few days with the band, he had already heard and recorded half of the tracks that previous year. He thought nothing in that studio could surprise him. And yet, one day, as he listened in on an early pre-production rehearsal, one song did. And as Grohl turned his drumsticks to sawdust, Vig found he couldn't help but pace around the room in excitement. This would be a common reaction for anyone first hearing Smells Like Teen Spirit. On the importance of singles in music, Mark But Evil wrote for this video, "They're like billboards for the ears, except they work infinitely better than a billboard." I just kind of felt like there needed to be a quote there. The quality of a great album's singles can make or break its success, especially in the 90s. Albums were long and expensive, and casual listeners needed to be convinced that they were worth buying. Smells Like Teen Spirit was convincing. Debuting on TV and radio just before the album hit stores, Teen Spirit quickly shed the bonds of small alternative spaces, escaping into countless mainstream radio stations and MTV's daytime programming. This was a big deal. Alternative bands had been airing on MTV since the mid-80s, but always during 120 minutes, which started at 1 a.m. Smells Like Teen Spirit was the first video to share airtime with Mariah Carey and Michael Jackson. And although we have to credit most of this success to the overwhelmingly catchy and rebellious nature of the song, we can't ignore the power of that video. Shot on a California soundstage in August of 1991, the high school may have been fake, but the students were real. Most of them attendees of the local Loyola Marymount University, who were invited to serve as extras on the music video through print and radio ads. An honor, I'm sure, only in hindsight, as at the time, the kids were pissed. This is thanks to the video's director, Sam Bayer, who made the fatal error of trying to tell a crowd of punks what to do. Tensions grew to the point where his job was split between filming the video and preventing utter mayhem. Not helping matters was Kurt Cobain, attempting to incite utter mayhem. He hated Bayer. He wanted prostitute cheerleaders and an indoor bonfire and real footage of people destroying actual cars in the parking lot. And Bayer didn't. Asshole, so he paid the price, because the moment the director let the kids out of their seats to film the riot scenes, an actual riot ensued. Once the kids came out dancing, they just said, "F*** you," because they were so tired of his shit throughout the day. And so, a legend was born. Rebellion defined Smells Like Teen Spirit, as it would define the legacy of Nirvana. But as proven by the chaotic nature of the video, you can't embody rebellion through music and lyrics alone. No, you have to live it. And Nirvana lived it. With all the loose ends wrapped up, Nevermind was officially completed sometime in early June. And while the band embarked on a short West Coast tour with Dinosaur Jr. soon after, they mostly took the following months to unwind. Though, ironically, Nirvana would have more fun getting back to work promoting the album than they ever did at home. That August, Kurt, Chris, and Dave boarded a plane to Cork, Ireland for a second European tour. And this time, it wouldn't suck. That was a wild tour. We got in a lot of trouble, busting stuff up, drunk, getting kicked out of clubs. Honestly, an understatement. Opening for their good friends Sonic Youth, the Goo Tour resembled a National Lampoon movie far more than a promotional obligation, featuring everything from food fights to fist fights on what could only be called a half-month-long party. Documentarian Dave Markey coincidentally filmed most of the fun for a Sonic Youth movie he was making, and explained to Charles Cross they joined what seemed like a traveling circus, and it didn't feel like a burden to them. It seemed more like a vacation. The band's ability to embrace and create chaos was a major factor in the success of Nevermind. Personality can go a long way in convincing the world to love you, and Nirvana had it in droves, from sarcastic interviews to hectic live performances. After a decade defined by excess and fraud in the music industry, these were a couple of small-town punks whose attitudes perfectly matched their music. It was a recipe for success. The Goo Tour wound down in September of 1991, and with Nirvana's return home soon after came the final step along the journey to Nevermind, the legendary Nevermind release party. Held at a small Seattle nightclub on Friday the 13th, good sign, it was supposed to be a subtle affair. Just close friends and industry people gathered in earnest celebration of a long-awaited release. But this is still Nirvana we're talking about. Alcohol was snuck in spite of Washington's at the time restrictive dry laws, and while most people were able to healthily imbibe and hang out, some could not. Notably, these three raucous douchebags who pissed everyone off. Making a mess, tearing down posters, throwing hors d'oeuvres. It was the band, you know it was the band. Nirvana got kicked out of their own party. A great metaphor, honestly. A whole night meant to venerate them as they entered a new chapter of fame and fortune. And Nirvana proved they were still the same old band. Right? Things started to happen after that. We weren't the same old band. Kurt, he just kind of withdrew. There was a lot of personal stuff that was going on. It was more than we bargained for. Nevermind released on September 24th, 1991. Coming out near the beginning of the fall school year, it coincided with a time when college radio DJs were looking for new music to fill the airtime. I guess you could say it was good timing, huh? Wink wink, nudge nudge. And while the release date had been set months in advance, it was only after considerable debate that DGC would decide how many copies to actually release. Yeah, that's right, it was the 90s after all. At this point in the music industry, unit quantity was still a major question. Sales relied on real actual tapes, CDs, and vinyls that cost real money to make. Print too many and you're throwing cash away. Too few and, well, you're throwing cash away! In the marketing meetings at the time, sales of 50,000 were what was planned, since Sonic Youth had sold at 118,000 of Goo. We figured if it could sell half that, we were doing good. The assumption by the suits at DGC was that since Nirvana were just a couple of rednecks from Aberdeen, they should keep expectations low. That was until 2 weeks later, when the band played at an industry showcase, or a concert for Geffen executives. Sounds fun. Photos from the event show it wasn't anything more than your average Nirvana concert, and yet, when the performance was finished, a Geffen vice president looked around and declared, "We'll sell 100,000. So, the final number chosen for the initial copies sent to stores was 46,251, with the expectation, I imagine, being that they would slowly ramp up the supply as demand slowly rose. It's not like millions of people would suddenly want the album all at once. Gulp. Alright, here's a quick economics quiz. What do you get when a commodity's demand exceeds its supply? That's right, a shortage. Okay. Now, what do you get when a commodity's demand exceeds its supply by a factor of 100? Right again, a fucking riot. If the abrasive sound of the album and the punk attitude of the frontman weren't enough to convince people that they were the cool band, perhaps the fact that you literally couldn't find the album in music stores half the time was more convincing. Or how nobody could get a ticket to their concerts. Remember, DGC had low expectations, so the venues booked for the band far in advance were those expecting low ticket sales. Nirvana was performing at a former movie theater in Portland the same night they were getting their gold record, and a nightclub in Birmingham the night they hit platinum. They were quickly becoming the biggest band on Geffen, but they were still playing sub-pop venues. Needless to say, many of these shows sold out months in advance, only building the band's hype to greater heights. Word of mouth would play a major role in the growth of Nirvana, but we mustn't ignore the influence of the mainstream press. Remember when I explained all the reasons Kurt wanted to ditch Sub Pop? Lack of publicity, tour support, a second album, and interviews. Sub Pop sucked at getting the band interviews, while DGC did not. The band was offered dozens of opportunities from magazines to MTV, and they took every single one.
Ow, you've hurt my arm! What?
Hey, f*** you, man!
So, the moment Nirvana made an impact, all these interviews came out at once, leading to what Mike Azerrad would call a gigantic Nirvana media blitz. The band was inescapable. While this segment of the video is technically called timing, the better word may be luck. Sure, DGC chose to ship a limited quantity of records to stores, and Nirvana chose to do 1 million interviews, but quotes taken since have shown that nobody really knew just how influential these decisions would be, or just how influential outside factors would be. Nirvana was not the first quote-unquote alternative rock band to make a splash in the mainstream. In fact, it's often been argued that the only reason major labels were stepping over themselves to sign the band is because they could see a precedent setting. Groups like REM and Sonic Youth had proven just how profitable the indie to major label pipeline could be. Nirvana rode that wave. And with a Sub Pop logo contractually obligated to stay on their album, they kept their cool while rising to greater heights than ever. Number 1 on the Billboard Top 200. I mentioned that achievement earlier, and while it really can't be understated, our friend timing was a factor here as well. They went up against some bad competition, so it wasn't hard for them to do great. But Mark, how could U2, Guns N' Roses, and Michael f***ing Jackson possibly be considered bad competition? Complicated legacies aside, these were popular artists. Well, popular is a relative term. Just because we remember these names decades later doesn't mean these artists have been consistently successful this whole time. Even the biggest fail sometimes. One of them died. Michael's a great example, actually. Although albums like Thriller and Bad reached heights Nirvana could only dream of, the considerably less iconic Dangerous comparably underperformed both critically and commercially. Is alliteration still charming? Similarly, U2's Achtung Baby and Guns N' Roses' odd double release were each on the smaller end of those bands' hits. Big, but small enough for Nirvana to slip past them. That's one theory, at least. These were still massively successful albums in hindsight. I did a spit take when I found out November Rain has 2 billion views on YouTube, so I don't know about this one. Yet, the vagueness of this explanation does transition nicely into our fourth and final reason for the album's success. Before you click off, I don't mean abstract as in the worst part of a science fair experiment. Those sucked, and I hated them. No. This section is dedicated to certain explanations that go beyond our traditional timeline of events. Those that require the mystical powers of hindsight. Or, in other words, all the shit I couldn't fit in the other categories. Like the Janet theory. An explanation for the album's success originally posed by Nirvana collaborator Steve Fisk and popularized by Nirvana biographer Mike Azerrad, thanks again Mike, the Janet theory describes an archetype. A woman whose rebellious nature inspired her to find the Smiths in the mid-80s, until their disbanding left her heartbroken. She then transitioned into a, quote, British death gloom phase in her late teens, with dyed black hair that made her stand out from her peers. But then they all dyed their hair too. So, in her relentless search for the next big eccentricity, she found Sub Pop. And when Nirvana emerged from Sub Pop with an album Fisk believed to be deeply coated with a British new wave flair, poor Janet, she couldn't help but like it. Among the believers of the Janet theory was Nirvana frontman Kurt Cobain, who gleefully told Azerrad, "It's probably true. But if you're like me, you may have found it all a little contrived." I mean, how many Janets were there, really? How influential were scorned Smiths fans in the success of Nevermind? Not very, I imagine. But the idea speaks to a greater voice in the audience of Nirvana fans. The young adults desperate for expression. The forgotten generation. Generation X, the middle children between boomers and millennials, are getting old. Nobody wants to age. It's a terrible burden. Your bones ache, your back hurts, your joints stiff, and your mind shrinks, your kids hate you. It stinks. But rewind the clock, and all these old fogies become young. I feel like I'm over-explaining a lot in this video, but once upon a time, Generation X occupied a very different role in the social hierarchy. Back then, they were the rebellious youth fighting the man, and they were losing. If we look at the music industry especially, boomers were still very much in charge in the 90s. Sure, there were popular artists born past 1965, but their managers, their A&R men, their bosses at the label, all boomers. Not just that, the Grammys were run by boomers, the radio, MTV, the Billboard charts, the music magazines. The old clung on to power, and only the music that they liked was allowed to succeed. This was a status quo that hindered many facets of the music industry. But just looking at rock music, it was getting stale. There was a ravenous market for something new. And Nevermind was the first album sold in major record stores with music videos on primetime that was written by kids for kids. Authentic Generation X rebellion, courtesy of Kurt Cobain. He really was the perfect voice of a generation. Oh shit. Alright, come on, let's be reasonable. I know the Voice of a Generation title has been thrown at Kurt a lot, in spite of his own complaints at the time, but for good reason. Kurt Cobain was the archetypal 90s young adult. From his childhood heartbreak at his parents' divorce, to his adolescence in Aberdeen, bored out of his mind experimenting with drugs, to his early adulthood, spent couch surfing and drinking too much. Kurt Cobain was the voice of a generation whether he wanted to be or not. And Nevermind was his outlet. Although I've chosen 4 major explanations for how Nirvana conquered the world in 1991, it's obviously much more complex than that. Even with everything I've described, there's no such thing as a sure hit. But if there was, Nevermind would be my prime candidate. This wouldn't be the end of Nirvana's story. Although we can argue that the band may have peaked here in terms of acclaim and popularity, there is still so much more to tell. With the album finished, Kurt Cobain not only got to work on another project, he was free to pursue other interests beyond music. So join me next time for the end of Nirvana. Hey folks, if you liked the video, like the video. If you want to see more, subscribe. I make more videos, so you should watch those videos. Thank you. In case you weren't paying attention, huge special thanks to Michael Azerrad, whose biography of the band was absolutely necessary reading for this video, and to all these other wonderful sources. Go check them out. I'm gonna leave now. Goodbye.